It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here late in the day in this very comfortably warm room for a conversation I think will be very interesting. So we in the space community have gone through a bit of a transformation in the last decade. We've seen quite a lot of venture investment, and we're many organizations across the ecosystem are grappling with the question of what next in terms of growth. And certainly one step in that growth path is institutional investment at a level to really support scaling. So the hypothesis of this panel is that we have a bit of an institutional investor gap, that we are not seeing private equity, we're not seeing sovereign wealth funds, we're not seeing, you know, the pension fund type investors targeting space at the level we might like. That's the hypothesis, and we have exactly, I think, the right panel to explore that hypothesis and consider whether it's right, whether it's wrong, and what we can do in response. So our panelists from the end are Mike French. Mike is the founder of Space Policy Group. Mike consults across the investment community and also has had a few other jobs, including Chief of Staff at NASA and working in the White House. We have Mr. Jae Kim, who is the CEO of Boryung, which is a Korea-based health investment firm that has made a major commitment to space. We have Dr. Agnieszka Lukaszek, who is well known to many of you as a senior leader at Planet, who is now running high altitude consulting and who has also been operating in the South and Central America region for the last several years, and so I think brings us some useful insights there. And Mr. Alessandro Izzo, Director, European Investment Bank, which is, of course, seeking to strengthen and enhance the investment landscape in Europe. So with that, I will jump right into our questions, and then hopefully we can also take some audience questions to really make this as conversational as possible. And so the first question I want to start with is, I alluded to this, but let's set the stage a little bit. We have been through a transformation in the space ecosystem in terms of investment. Agnieszka, you've spent a good portion of your career in recent years at a company created through that venture wave. Can you talk a little bit about where we are now?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carissa, and thank you for the invitation. Apologies for my voice. Probably by the end of the week, I will not be saying anything anymore. But it is really exciting period to be in, indeed. I entered the space sector in 2006, and since then, I mean, you know, we are in a space renaissance that is clear. Companies like SpaceX, Planet, Spire, ISI were created and mainly through venture capital money and doing amazing things, right? Something that we couldn't even imagine would be happening before. I mean, I'm sure you all saw what happened with this little thing SpaceX did yesterday, which was extremely impressive. So we are part of something larger, you know. It's not just about governments. It's not just about the traditional defense contractors. It's about those who also want to make a difference and be impactful. And investors see it as a potential. And I think that's very exciting.
So we've had this infusion of, depending on whose number you pay attention to, I'm going to quote the number that my company came up with, which is, you know, more than $60 billion of venture capital and 500 to 600 new firms around the world, predominantly in the U.S. and in other nations as well. As those companies grow, as they take that investment, establish capabilities, seek to grow, they're looking for customers. And before we get into the question of investment, let's talk a little bit about the market and where those customers, where that growth seems to be coming from to frame the environment investors are looking at. So Alessandro, do you want to talk a little bit about where you see the market at the moment?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to join the panel. I think that, just to resonate a bit the words of Agnieszka, we've seen a fantastic change of paradigm globally, but also in Europe in the last 10, 15 years. And with, let's say, commercialization of space, we've seen the opening of a completely new sort of universe of investors on one hand and of potential users of space technology and infrastructure. Now, just to go straight to your question, today the main use and the main sort of like from an investment viewpoint as well, potential takeout of these technologies follows a bit also general macroeconomic and political trends. So we've seen a bit of a reverse between downstream and upstream sort of the technologies and investments because of on one hand macroeconomic and fundraising sort of situation changing for companies that traditionally were approaching more commercial markets. So in that space we've seen a bit of reduction of traction and activities, whereas for political and also long-term sort of strategic investment planning decisions, we've seen in the upstream space a bit of more activity. And this is actually also from a European perspective, certified by, if you see the activity of VCs in the two segments, that quite paradoxically, or I wouldn't say paradoxically, but quite intuitively with the statement I just made, in 2023 reversed a bit the exposure to upstream and downstreams, whilst until 2020 the majority of investments were in the downstream space. Now actually the curve has turned for the reason I just said.
So downstream space, satellite services, targeting end users, upstream more to the manufacturing, hardware side?
Launchers, all the in-orbit services,
Yep.
and also would say part of the Earth observation.
With significant government involvement in that shift as a customer?
Yes, definitely. Mostly, I would say, in giving the strategic direction, so with a part of support in terms of policy and also revenues. But the figures I was mentioning are really, private VC money flowing into Europe. So, you see where actually private money is following public money, and between parentheses, that's also the investment thesis of my institution. We're a public bank. We're there to invest directly into equity and venture debt in innovative startups, including in space ones, but with a clear signaling, goal, which is that of like addressing and understanding where the market gaps are, what are the technology solutions that need to be pursued, and partnering also with public and private financiers.
So, Jay, you have clearly a view about where the market is going, what is going to be significant, and your company has significantly committed to reflect that view. So, from the perspective of your investment, also more broadly, again, where do you see the market going? That's kind of creating the context for a larger investment.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me at the panel. And if you talk about the flow of the capital into this industry, I think everyone knows that most of the capital that were supporting the companies were coming from governments. And we are yet to, we talk about VCs, but we are yet to see the big names of the VCs from Silicon Valley, so to speak. We are yet to see a major investment from firms like Sequoia or Andreessen Horowitz. The money's not coming in from them yet. So you also mentioned about who are the customers for utilizing the infrastructures that the space companies are building. It's early stage venture or startups that are mostly funded by government grants or government support, so to speak.
So I was just going to interject very quickly. I think it's really interesting. Jay, I think you're talking about what we'll call the in-space activities market.
Yes.
Commercial human spaceflight, on-orbit pharmaceutical development, and that has been such a tiny proportion of the venture investment, exactly as you point out.
Yes.
Whereas we have seen Andreessen Horowitz and we have seen Sequoia on the satellite side.
Right.
So yes, okay. So
Yeah.
just
Thank you for
to
correcting
clarify.
that. Yeah, thank you for
very
correcting that.
interesting.
So I'm speaking from the area that I know, so to speak. Yeah. So that has been the case, and there is a company like us where we make venture investments, as well as we also write big checks, investments such as the investment that we made into Axiom. And I don't think we will be the last one who will be doing so. If there's a company who sees the value of utilizing the benefits of microgravity or environment in space, I'm sure that there will be more companies jumping in and trying to innovate. And it's personally, I'm starting to feel that this new part of space are gaining attentions and interest from a very large, renowned Silicon Valley venture capitals. So I think that has been a change in a couple of years.
Interesting. So, Mike, I know you have opinions on the market and where it's going. And can you talk a little bit about where growth is likely to happen, where maybe there's going to be some challenges? Again, setting the stage for how investors are going to view the market going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think when we look at the space economy, it is about connectivity. Right, a huge portion of the space economy for decades, the commercial space economy has been about satellite services. Right, increasingly you're seeing that wedge transform from video to broadband. Right, and so I think there's it is clear that will continue, and then we'll continue to see that growth there. I think you see a pretty steady set of activity across the launch market, across manufacturing. Right, fairly stable, and the real growth then comes in. Can that connectivity market expand well beyond what TV-based services could do? The other area where I think there's a potential for quite a bit of growth, but there's been a lot of, I think, fits and starts in unlocking it, is how do we turn Earth observation data into how do we get that into the right customer channel? Right, I think that we've had, Neska, your former employer, we've had a lot of space companies that are trying to turn that data into an analytical tool. And I think where we're seeing some really interesting stuff is where you're having non-space companies, industrial goods companies, other companies adding space data into the existing data they already use. And to me, that's somewhere in there, if you mix that connectivity with Earth observation data, to me, that's where you potentially see this possible step change in a market jump.
Okay, so we've talked about essentially 4 general areas. We've talked about satellite services and telecommunications, pretty mature, active market undergoing a transformation. We've talked about remote sensing, where we've seen many companies start following venture investment, where the investment thesis was we're going to be able to serve new sectors of the economy by providing them a new type of information, and those companies are still working to realize that thesis. I think we would all agree. We've talked about the in-space activities, human spaceflight, and platforms and exploration and research and pharmaceutical development and other product development, where there's interest, there's certainly some investment by companies like Boryung and into companies like Axiom. There's still a very substantial government role there. And then we've talked about sort of the upstream piece, which is being activated by every one of those markets in different ways, as well as, I would assert, national security considerations as well. Okay, so that's where we're at. Now, how do they grow? Where does the capital come for those sectors to go to the next level? And sort of, the kind of simplistic model is that's either more government money or private equity money. So it's not quite as simple a venture versus private equity. There's a little bit of a continuum there. Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked about $60 billion over the last 2 decades going to space. If you look at that investment, about 70% of that has been venture capital. Private equity has been about 5%. Then you got about 10% in IPOs and debt and acquisition type spending, right? So that kind of makes sense though, right? I mean, what is venture doing? It's putting its money into high risk for potentially high returns, right? So for many of these space sectors, it makes a lot of sense that's where that money is. So when we look at that private equity money, I guess I'll be, I'm not sure if it's contrarian or optimistic. I guess I'll be optimistic, right? I actually
Contrarian would be on brand, but you know, go ahead for optimistic.
I'm going to be the Danny Rojas of space investment. And so when you look at where private equity money is going, right, there's sort of 2 channels where you see it. The first is sort of that classic private equity model where they're saying, with our dollars, we think we can do something different with perhaps combining a couple companies or splitting up a company, or we think that we can put different management in there to gain potential, right? Sort of the classic private equity model. You're seeing that in space, right? We've actually seen some really interesting deals recently, right? You're seeing that with OHB and KKR. You saw that with Maxar and Advent. We're hearing about Eutelsat and its ground stations now. So you're seeing those kind of classic private equity type actions. But the other thing you're seeing that I think is kind of interesting in space, you're seeing PE firms act like venture capital firms. And part of that is because we're seeing these really big rounds. I think a lot of people thought we were done with these super, 100 million plus rounds, and here we are. We just saw 2 or 3 of them. And in those big rounds, you're seeing private equity firms acting as essentially venture capital partners in those rounds, right? And so there's almost like a different model coming in play with some of these recent large numbers.
So, so your view is largely looking at the U.S. market. There is private equity engagement. It's often of a different flavor than maybe what we think of as the conventional model. So let's kind of maybe talk through. I'm going to speculate about the level of activity and go in that order. So Alessandro, I think Europe is next on this panel in terms of, are you seeing companies get the financing they need to grow to that next level? Are you seeing the putting companies together to create a platform or to create a new capability? Or are you seeing companies struggle and worry about going out of business? Because I want to come back to that.
Well, what we can see in Europe, I think it's a paradigm which is reflective a bit of in general, the growth stage of many European tech champions. So, we're quite good at the first phase of research, of spin out, early stage seeding and early stage investment. There is enough of, public-private money, some institution like us, the European Innovation Council, Commission. So we kind of like grow company to, let's say, the Series B, C stage. Then that's the big, question mark. That's where we actually have, some of the companies have to look at, the other side of the Atlantic to grow. There isn't the depth of the capital market. And also, whilst we've seen more venture capital and some private equity activity in Europe, we actually do not have the depth of big, deep pocket funds that are capable of funding these mega rounds. There are initiatives that are there to develop the whole ecosystem of 1 billion plus funds. The European Tech Champion Initiative, which is sponsored by a few member states and the European Investment Fund and the EIB, is actually there to create with a 5 billion sort of initial endowment, investing as LP in funds that have raised 1 billion more, with some verticals dedicated to deep tech and space. So there is, I'd say, an attempt to kind of like develop that ecosystem. But we need to be conscious of the fact that today, unfortunately, we're still a bit behind some other markets. Now, this said, where we've seen also some activity is in, if you want, consolidation and, I wouldn't say the listing, but, bringing back private some of the companies that went public in the US with SPAC structures. And that's where some private money is flowing into the sector. And I think that's where we will see it for the next couple of years.
So I'm going to press on that a little bit because you framed this largely as we need to build the capital base, build the investment ecosystem, bring the companies along. So those are, so that is a very positive thing from the point of view of government interest in space companies. But it also is indicative of some of the challenges those companies are having. There are certainly industries that don't need that kind of fostering and support. What makes, in your view, why does space need that? Is it because it's so capital intensive? Is it because of the timelines? Is it because...
It's a combination of these things. I mean, I think with Europe being a little bit behind the US in terms of development of specialist sort of VC and PE investors, there is a risk aversion to high technology risk combined with demand and market risk and long, if you want, payback times of the investment. All these actually push private money, especially in the venture capital and private equity space, in other subsectors other than space. But, to be optimistic, in fact, actually, in the last 2 years, there has been a bit of, in the general sort of like reduction a bit of private money flow into the VC and PE space in Europe. In the deep tech subsector, space has been the one that has remained the most resilient. Actually, has increased this percentage. So it's still smaller compared to the money that's flowing generally to deep tech, but this is, I think, quite significant and indicative of the fact that there is a growing sort of awareness of the fact that probably the risk proposition is not so disaligned to other high-risk sector in the deep tech space, that there are some good commercial uses and good co-investors that can actually lead rounds or signal the sort of like the validity of the technological and business proposition. And that is a mounting political support. I mean, especially in European space today, everything which has to do with security, defense, space, enabling technologies is looked at with a renowned sort of like interest and public support in terms of regulation, policy, and also money.
I think that the shifting posture of France and of Germany, to a lesser extent the UK, around national security and space and national security has had such an impact on that community and that conversation. Agnieszka, I think your answer on South and Central America is going to be a short answer, so I'm going to ask you if you want to weigh in a bit on your experience in the European ecosystem and growth and investment, and then give us a sense of what you've observed in South America, and then we'll hear about...
Absolutely. So space is hard, right? It's a hard business. So we have to assume that some of these companies are just not going to make it, and it's okay, right? That's how it works. And investors need to take those risks, right? They need to kind of figure it out. Where is it worth it to put their money in? It's an interesting thing that when you look at the numbers of startups in the US and in Europe, they're pretty much around the same. The number is very similar. The difference is about scale-ups, right? In the US, a lot of companies are scaling up, and in Europe they don't. They just close down the business, or they stay as very small, tiny companies, or somebody buys them, or whatever. Why is that? Because as it was pointed correctly by Alessandro, there's lots of seed money, there's lots of grants, and this is all great, but there comes the point where they actually need contracts, they need business, and that's where it gets tricky, because for governments it's difficult to give them business because it's taxpayers' money. So will they, risk it? And the ecosystem is not yet, the downstream ecosystem is not yet developed well enough to get those customers. So I'm kind of maybe jumping to also what was mentioned before, but I've seen a huge change, in this kind of awareness of how useful space technology can be. So we need to, we're reaching out to sectors that have nothing to do with space, especially with Earth observation that Mike mentioned, where we need to let them know that we are part of the solution for them, right? We can answer some of their questions, because they don't care where the data is coming from. They just want answers to their questions. And we need to let them know we're part of the solution. And that's where those customers are going to be in agriculture, in deforestation, in insurance, in energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is what is happening in Latin America, for instance. I mean, you even have less investment. It's much more difficult to grow a business, and you also often get this kind of tendency where governments sometimes feel like this private sector is competing with them a little bit. So they lobby against, they prefer that the investment comes to the national agency rather than to the private sector. And that obviously doesn't help to build that ecosystem. But we need to, we need to evangelize and kind of, because, it's the fusion of data that really is the answer, and we're delivering that data.
It's such an interesting topic. I've had a conversation with someone and who was saying, look, if the money comes to the government, or if the government is spending money, it is buying capability, space capability, from offshore, from out of region. And really, there needs to be a shift in how you think about government money, so the focus is on building regional capability, because otherwise, forever that region is a customer, never a capability.
Absolutely. If I can add to this too, I think you can see it as a problem or not. I let you decide. But building hardware is sexy, right? Everybody wants to have their own satellites. Everybody wants to have that they have a space program. So a lot of countries now, on a national level, they build constellations for various things. I mean, that's not really helping for companies to be, for startups to actually get into that business, because if the data coming from satellites is given for free, then how are they going to thrive? So instead of what you said, instead of buying capabilities, a lot of times governments are choosing to invest in their own capabilities, and that's not really helping the business. So I think this is something that we need to look at in Europe as well.
So, Jay, in the environment that you're operating in, and the region that you're operating in, and in the sector of space that you're operating in, how's the big money flowing?
So before this discussion, I had a brief chat with Carissa about this issue, and she asked me, do you see any private equity investment in our region? Region meaning Korea more specifically, because we don't have a government body such as EU. I mean, in Far East, we have China, we have South Korea, we have Japan, but we all work independently, so to speak. So my answer was no. Maybe if we include some of the satellite or launch systems business, it would be a different answer. But when I talk about space investment from my perspective, I largely talk about the companies or the technologies or the platforms that are being built to enable us to go beyond LEO. So in that specific sector, we don't see any private equity activities. So personally, I went out and tried to talk to many private equity investors, like large names, Blackstones, KKRs, Apollo. But what I realized was that, because I invest in space station business, when I tell them that we are an investor in space station, like a commercial space station, they ask me back saying, so what kind of business is that? So that was the actual response. So they just don't understand they don't know how to categorize the space station as a business. So I went back and thought about it, and we really need to change people's perspective in looking at these assets that are being built. So if we say, go out and talk to these private equity firms or institutional investors and saying that, do you want to invest in like a space infrastructure with this national space agencies being as an anchor tenant, they show interest. And then I tell them it's a space station. And, okay, so is it like a data center, or is it like a real estate? So it's very close to real estate model on Earth. And then they understand. So I think the missing part when we're trying to attract more capital from these large investors is to change their perspective, change the framing. And in Korea, we are trying really hard to do that. And when we go out and try to explain what Axiom is trying to do, it's a large, no, it's not a large, it's a R&D laboratory that will host most of the space agencies around the world as an anchor tenant, and then they get it. So I think that's our role, and more work needs to be done to change people's mind.
So I want to pull that thread because it's a really interesting one. It's very difficult to change the fundamental economics of a particular business or of a sector. However, if change can be affected in terms of how it is explained, in terms of educating the community, in terms of speaking to a different investor community, I think that's really interesting. So I've had conversations around investors who focus on energy systems, big power plants. And there's some really nice parallels with certain kinds of space investments. Capital intensive, check. Long timelines, check. Challenging technology, check. Now, the one thing the energy investors are more accustomed to is relatively predictable user base and returns. And that's where it's a different conversation with many kinds of space entities. But I think that, that idea of reframing how you communicate with the investor community, either in terms of what you're communicating or with whom you're communicating, is really intriguing. So Mike the Optimist, so do you feel like there's real traction there, or is that not going to make a significant difference?
I think we can talk about it, but right? I think we need to talk about customers, not technology, right? We love technology. We want to talk about customers, not technology. But then there actually have to be customers, right? So that's the other part of it. But I think your energy example is really good, right? So if we look at, there's an incredible amount of money going into developing small-scale nuclear systems, right? That's a very hard technology. It's got a lot of work that needs to be done. But people put money into it because the sector is energy, right? It doesn't matter that it's nuclear or small nuclear. It matters that it's a new way of selling energy, right? And when we do that, where we do that in space, that's those examples we were talking about before, right? Communications, there's an active market of all kinds of investors in that. We've seen that in launch, right? There's a clear customer base. We see quite a bit of different types of money going to launch. So I think that we need to be customer focused, but we also got to realize there has to be revenue, right? We need some revenue to show that those customers actually connect to a business line. I think we'll be successful if in any subspace market we can say that market without using the word space. So we're not space communications, we're communications, right? Yep. We're not space transportation, we're transportation, right? When we
not space pharma, we're pharma.
Right. When we can start thinking about, when space can be credibly talked about, when the capability that's space-based can be credibly talked about without the space component, to me, where that's happened, that's where you see the diversity of money going to it.
And we're a community that's not well suited to doing that, right? We are a very space-identified community, and we work in all different sectors of the community, but we have this connection, which I think is a strength in many ways, but it's very that's a different kind of cultural approach. Agnieszka, what?
No, 100%. I mean, it's about delivering. It's about having the right narrative, right? And to think about your audience, because we have a tendency also, what you said about listening to customers. I mean, I know a lot of brilliant people in this sector, right? But a lot of times we're like, ooh, technologically, whatever, this idea is amazing. Let's build this or create this. They don't think about the market, right? Like, how are they gonna sell this later? So the thinking needs to be really, what is actually needed that can be sellable, and then build it. Yeah, it's a very different approach. It's more business-oriented rather than tech-oriented or science-oriented. I don't know how you would call it.
Okay, so Alessandra, you're working to build a space investment ecosystem, and we're coming to the conclusion that we shouldn't be talking about the space piece of it. But what's your sense of how?
I think that
I think that's what I heard really makes me, think a bit about, in fact, the role of an institution like the European Investment Bank. You would wonder how come, a 90 billion, balance sheets bank, traditionally funding infrastructure and sovereigns, is active in space, and that's exactly a bit the paradigm. I mean, at the end, when we started moving into direct operations in venture debt, so financing innovation and technology, we started with biotech, but then to a certain extent, looking at some of the propositions that were coming from the space ecosystem, we saw some similarities with energy and transportation. At the end, you look at certain sectors, clean tech, biotech. When you put together, development risk, payback time, they are as risky as space. So, I don't think that we heard at the beginning, space is a hard sector, but when you finance innovation and growth, I mean, there are very many other sectors that are equally risky. So that change in paradigm, I think, and that kind of education to give some commercial traction and private investment into the sector, I think it's necessary.
I remember very early on in this, the sort of the decade of venture capital, I went out and interviewed a number of venture firms that were starting to put money into space. And one of the significant enablers was simply that space had become more acceptable as an opportunity to bring to their partners, that it was something that you could talk about. There had been a few high-profile billionaires who'd made a bunch of tech money, putting money into space, and so it moved from something that was not the norm to something that was part of the conversation. And I wonder if we're having the next version of this. So we've got a bit of time. I'd love to take some questions from the audience. We'll just do it the simple way and pass you a mic if we've got a question back there in the far row on the outside. A very energetic microphone.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Tongwane Namane. I'm from SCS Space Commercial Services, and we're a satellite engineering company based in South Africa. My question is directed at Mr. Izzo. So, the reason I came through to this session was speaking around institutional investors. So space, in terms of commercialization, comes from a traditionally military background, right, which is government. And then you had the academic era coming in, and then the space entrepreneurship era coming in. And obviously that is almost a jump into the private sector type of investing in space. So what happened with the institutional aspect, and the question that I want to ask you, is how do you see the mandate not being aligned in terms of institutional investors are supposed to actually play the role between bridging the gap with new technologies, with new industries, with industrialization, but that isn't necessarily happening. And that has to do with a large risk aversion aspect. And if institutional investors are not going to play that role regarding long payback periods, for example, and 10, 20-year project life cycles, then how can we expect the private sector to play that role? So are we going to find a situation where institutional investors are literally going to come in at the end of the curve, or is there still space for institutional investors to actually play their mandate, which is supposed to be a bridge to industrialization?
Okay, thanks. Thanks. Very, very interesting question. Well, first of all, I think we need to clarify a bit the use of terms. What do we intend by institutional investors? Do we intend public investment players like, the European Investment Bank, European Innovation Council, the EC, public, DARPA or the likes in the US, or are we looking at actually institutional money held by wealth funds, insurance companies, big private money? Because I think the role the role and the positioning is slightly different. I mean, I totally agree with you that in any technology and sector that needs scaling up, the next sort of paradigm for growth goes through attracting the latter part of institutional money into the pot, and that's where there is a role for institutions of the former kind that we can still call institutional investors, like the European Investment Bank, European Investment Fund, with the help of specialized agencies like the European Space Agency, the European the European Defense Agency and the likes. So we can actually look at specific, key technologies and try to take part of the risk of, the first, technological development and rollout phase for institutional investors of the kind of, venture funds, insurance companies or pension funds to come in. These type of schemes have been developed more for the sort of like scale up of sectors like clean tech today or biotech, less for space. But I think this is where some thinking is being put in understanding that there has to be kind of like a different apportionment of risk returns between different categories of institutional investors.
So I want to take the next question, but very quickly, Jay. Japan, of course, has been very active in government involvement, in motivating at least corporate investment in innovative space companies. But on this question of government institutional investors, how has that been a resource for you?
I think that will come in near future because our own space agency called CASA has been just formed this May. And I think the model that Japanese government is trying to develop with their like private corporations such as Mitsui, like Mitsubishi, those trading houses are very applicable to us in Korea. So what we're trying to develop with CASA is to form this private-public partnership with CASA and us, and in tackling this human health problem for our Humans in Space program. And I mean, we did it even without their support, but CASA and NASA just announced recently that they will collaborate officially in tackling the human health problem in space. And they sent out a clear message. And with that support and with that intent and willingness to spend some money, I think that will flourish with the private sectors.
Thank you. And I think we have a question. Yes, somebody has the mic, so we'll go with that. And then I've got one more up front, then I think that's all we'll have time for.
Thank you for this excellent panel. My name is Sofia Biro, and I'm curious that what do you recommend for emerging European nations that are engaged in space industry but on an early level, and how to boost their space economies? So government fund is limited and small, medium-sized enterprises are already present but seems to be a bit stuck. Thank you.
A little bit. So first of all, government funding doesn't need to be limited. If you look at the GDP of US and the whole EU, Europe has money, it just spends it elsewhere, right? So that's number one. Number two is that, at least obviously for my, I'm more looking from space down to like Earth observation, this is where I come from. You can get budgets and money and investment from, there doesn't need to be a space budget, but there can be a budget to deal with deforestation, climate, environment, agriculture. And that's where they should buy solutions to mitigate those problems. And some of those solutions are space solutions. So we need to be also creative how we approach governments and not think with that space lens, at least in some areas. Because the money is there, we just need to know how to approach it.
Thank you. And we've got time for one more question.
I want to jump in there. I want to, and I don't know, I want to actually, in that question, I think Poland is a really good example.
I'm from Poland.
I know. I think Poland's right. I think Poland's doing a couple things that are really interesting. One, they've capitalized on, they've seen the advantages of space from a national security perspective and are thinking about those capabilities. But also, I think they've done a good job of categorizing their capabilities, whether that's in certain hardware areas or certain software or computing areas, and seeing how they can partner either with other European nations or with other companies to help develop their homegrown capabilities, but in a partnership model. So I actually think there's probably a lot to learn from their activity just in the last few years.
Thank you, Mike. So one final question. It's a bit of a lightning round question, so we'll have an interesting but quick answer.
Hi, my name is Akshat Jori. I'm from India. I work for a financial institution in India. My question is to Mr. Alessandro, in fact, all the panelists. Space is critical infrastructure. It's a sector which is, like Mr. French mentioned, connectivity based. It's very much like telecommunication towers. It's very much like mass transit. It's important to us. It's crucial for us, in fact. How come when you mention numbers of venture capitalists spending 70%, private equity being 5%, like infrastructure projects are funded under project financing, there is no debt, long-term debt funding here? How has that not been done so far? Because the concession period, because we had a session of PPP just before this, where concession periods were discussed. And we do fund, even India funds, new tech like renewable energy, like biotech, under infrastructure. So how come there is no long-term funding for debt?
Absolutely, jump in.
I was going to say one case that I've talked to a very large debt-based financing firm. It's that they didn't have they needed to see more of a revenue expectation to pay off that debt in the tail, right? So that's where energy works, because even if it's a new technology, they're able to quantify possible energy-based returns to pay off the debt. Very difficult when it's an emerging market.
If I can add on this, I mean, we have financed, we've looked at financing space infrastructure on a fixed income, long-term debt basis with returns that are commensurate to that risk. If, using the analogy of came on the use of a space station, you can actually stabilize the cash flows of the use of the infrastructure to repay debt. But, there is also debt that can be provided, but at returns that are closer to equity if you do not have that stabilization of, your, cash flows, your demand and revenue side, and with a high technology risk. I mean, in the bank, we have a team that has a dedicated product for scale-up debt that is actually supporting those type of business ventures in scaling up. But if you do not have the stability of cash flows and in view of cash flows, well, the returns are not going to be those that you can expect for a PPP in an infrastructure.
Any final? Yep, Jay?
So I can speak in terms of a space station business. Because it's the first time for a private company to build a space station, the investors feel unsafe, I guess. But I have seen some large US banks who are saying that if a company successfully launch a module, then they are willing to create a leasing model on top of the second module. So I think once we show that this can be done, the flow of the air will just dramatically change.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being part of this discussion. I think this is a discussion we'll be having in future years. Some really interesting paths forward, and I want to ask you to join me in thanking our excellent panel for being here today.